this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, I'm joined by Barrett Tillman. We're going to be looking at the closing weeks of the war in 1945. August would see the Russians enter the war against Japan, the atomic bombs were dropped, and there was an attempted coup in Japan. The culmination of all this was the final declaration of surrender by Japan's Emperor Hirohito on the 15th of August, followed a couple of weeks later by the formal ceremony on the USS Missouri, presided over by General MacArthur. Barrett specialises in naval and aviation topics and has a prestigious back catalogue. His latest book is When the Shooting Stopped, August 1945. Welcome, Barrett. Thanks for joining me. Let's start with at the beginning of August 1945. Did the Allies think they were on the brink of victory in the Pacific?
The Allies, and that phrase is well taken because the shooting had to stop across an enormous expanse of planet Earth, not just in the Western Pacific off Japan, but on the Asian mainland, in China, in Burma, in Indonesia, on so many bypassed Pacific islands that had been seized by the U.S. and British forces in the previous couple of years. The unknown quantity, of course, was the atomic bombs, which was a very closely held secret. Those assault troops who were scheduled to land against fierce opposition in Operation Downfall, which was a two-phase plan, the invasion of Kyushu, the southern island, slated for November of 1945, and then the main event on Honshu the following March. Those troops, including those already in the Pacific and some who were redeploying from Europe, had essentially given themselves over to whatever fate awaited them because they knew from long, bitter experience how tenacious the Japanese were in defense and offense. So the outlook for your rifle-carrying British or Australian or American infantrymen was pretty grim, knowing that the Japanese had fought literally to the bitter end at Saipan, where we saw civilians jumping off cliffs, at Okinawa, where civilians were doing what they could to support the Japanese military, last-ditch bitter enders in fighting in caves and on ridge tops, just untenable situations. But the outlook for the ordinary soldier or sailor at the beginning of August 1945 was pretty grim.
How far had they got in the planning for the occupation of the mainland islands? Because if you think about D-Day, they're literally planning Overlord for years in advance.
The planning stage for Operation Downfall, which was, as I said, two-phase, Operation Olympic on Kyushu and Coronet on Honshu, was very well advanced. In fact, it was so advanced that changes were being made, if not on a daily, then probably on a weekly basis, as more signals intelligence, radio decrypts, came to the Allied headquarters, and they began to realize that the Japanese military, of course, had astutely analyzed the most likely landing beaches and were reinforcing those accordingly. So the planning stage for both Olympic and Coronet was very much a work in progress at that time.
Part of the problem I envisage must be just the logistics of it. I mean, you're fighting a long way from Allied territory, so the whole logistics arm to ship everything from either Britain, Europe, or America must have been phenomenal when it came to the planning.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The whole island of Okinawa in addition to supporting major air efforts with U.S. Army Air Force and Marine Corps squadrons and groups and wings, also included Iwo Jima. And that's a separate but related issue. The conventional wisdom today seems to hold that largely the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington directed the seizure of Iwo Jima, which is 750 miles south of Tokyo, as a stopping place for damaged B-29 bombers. That's something of a simplification. The most immediate reason for taking Iwo Jima was for land-based Army fighters, mainly P-51s, but also P-47s, to escort heavy bombers over the Japanese mainland. However, beyond that, Iwo Jima and the Bonin Islands generally were seen as a logical logistics base to support the massive supplies that were going to be needed once the Allied troops were ashore in Japan, and also to receive the heavy casualties that they knew would ensue from fighting in the Japanese mainland. So the entire logistics and supply picture is much broader than most people realize.
I think it's one of the overlooked topics of the Pacific in some respects. Everyone concentrates, it's probably movies, on the excitement of beaches and the Marines charging ashore, and actually you think at the vast expanse of sea that everything's having to be brought across it's a testament to American industrial strength, being able to produce enough shipping and goods and material, which must have continually been in transit to get there. It's fantastic. So I've made a note to myself about Purple Hearts when you were talking about Operation Downfall. They produced enough. Tell me about the story about the Purple Hearts. They overproduced them?
The Army was the acquiring agency for I guess, all medals for the U.S. military in World War II. And probably 20 years ago, the question of additional Purple Hearts, and it was a few 100,000 extra in addition to those already on hand, arose in context of what would be the likely American casualties in event that we had to take the Japanese home islands literally a yard at a time. It's still considered a controversial subject, but the Army analysts looked at the casualty rates in regard to territory seized, and of course, Okinawa was the most immediate. And as I recall, the number of casualties per square mile on Okinawa was translated to Kyushu and Honshu, and that was a pretty simple mathematical equation as to how many more Purple Hearts would be issued to the families of the slain or to the wounded who survived. And that number, which I think was approximately 300,000 plus whatever was already on hand, was enough to last well into the Vietnam War in the late 1960s.
Absolutely incredible statistic. If we turn to the Japanese, at the start of August, the Allies are closing in. What are the realities facing the Japanese?
There's a German phrase called cloud cuckoo land, which ordinary Germans use to describe the warped, the lopsided attitude of those in command. I don't know if there's a Japanese equivalent, but it amounts to the same thing. Ordinary Japanese in Tokyo and Yokohama, the other metropolitan areas, on a daily basis could look up and see what they called B-SAN, B-SAN, the super fortresses cruising overhead, usually with very little opposition. Some people also knew that there was an immense British and American armada, variously the Third Fleet and the Fifth Fleet, cruising the home islands waters almost uncontested at times. So the average Japanese knew that things were not going well. And by August 1945, some of them realized that they had been massively lied to for the previous 3 years, announcing one victory as another after another, when in fact the Allies were steadily approaching in greater and greater strength. Around July of 1945, and I discovered this in a previous book, Whirlwind, which, as far as I know, is the only single volume account of all air operations over Japan. Some American Army pilots and naval aviators from aircraft carriers flying low over Honshu and Kyushu reported civilians out in the open waving white sheets or clothing as a sign of not really surrender, but recognizing the reality. So, as I say, the Japanese hierarchy was badly divided, and that's why I devote 1 or 2 chapters in When the Shooting Stopped to there's no other word for it, the palace intrigue with the 6-man war council, which essentially ruled Japan from 1941 to 45, seriously split down the middle. 3 hardliners who feared what the Japanese officials later called losing Japaneseness of spirit, and those who recognized that surrender was the only option. And that's why it was such a remarkable development when Emperor Hirohito broke with centuries of tradition and precedent and took the step, as he called, to bear the unbearable and overrule the deadlocked war council in favor of accepting the surrender terms.
Well, while we're on the political subject, I was going to flip to the Allies, because there's so much happens sort of at the end of the war. From the Allied point of view, you get a change of leadership, which is intriguing within itself. Truman becomes president, and Churchill loses to Attlee in 45. So by the time we get to August, we have 2 new faces at the top table. I wondered if that changed anything from the Allied point of view. Did they politically bring anything to the table on on the running of the war, or how Japan might be treated? Because it is FDR who initially brings forward the idea of unconditional surrender as well, isn't it? Who's no longer there.
Yeah, Truman was in a really difficult position because, for whatever reason, Roosevelt had told him almost nothing. And in fact, in the book, I quote Bess Truman, Harry's wife, as confiding to her daughter, Franklin told Harry almost nothing. So Truman was suddenly in the hot seat and having to play catch up, not only with what the American policy was going to be for the end of the war and the post-war world, but trying to coordinate with the rest of the big 3. As you properly note, Churchill, who gave way to Attlee, overlapping the Potsdam Conference in July, and then both of them having to deal with Stalin, who had already pledged to come into the war against Japan within, I think, about 90 days of the end of the war in Europe. So very much a complex, multi-tiered situation. And I think it says a great deal about Stalin that even though Moscow had a standing, well-established non-aggression pact with Tokyo dating from, I think, 1941 or 42, Stalin had already decided to abrogate that treaty. And of course, the rail and road traffic across the Eurasian landmass after May of 1945, with Germany's capitulation, was almost entirely eastbound, to the 3-front offensive being planned into Japanese-held Manchuria. And of course, that did happen on August 9th, which was the same day as the second bomb, which was dropped on Nagasaki.
Truman isn't aware of the atomic bomb, is he? Oddly enough, he's aware of a large amount of spending going somewhere, but wasn't aware of what it was going on. Do we know how he felt about the use of the bomb? Did he put any? I don't know. Did he make any decisions of where it could be used, couldn't be used, how it was going to be used?
Of course, he did not know about the Manhattan Project when he inherited the presidency, but he was told, I think, by General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, on that day. Of course, that was in April of 1945, and the first nuclear test in New Mexico was in the middle of July. From that point on, Truman really had what I would call a minimal role in the decision. People talk about Truman deciding to drop the bombs. Actually, Truman did not make that decision. He simply decided not to interfere with the process that was already underway. He made contradictory statements both during and after the war. Shortly after, I guess immediately after Hiroshima on August 6th, he received an urgent message from the U.S. Council of Churches asking that Truman withhold any additional nuclear strikes until the Japanese had time to reply. And of course, that was an attitude taken out of context because at that time, Japan did not reply to the initial strike. And while the Council of Churches wanted to reduce the cost in human lives, Truman said, I wish that Japan had considered the cost in human lives on Pearl Harbor and since. And he listed a couple of atrocities that the Japanese military had committed during the war. However, after Nagasaki on August 9th, Truman again injected himself into the process, saying that he was personally taking control of the atomic bombs and that there would not be a third bomb unless he specifically approved it. I forget the source, but one of the commentators who had advised him said that Truman thought, in his phrase, all those kids. And later, I think in one of his memoirs, I think he wrote two, he said that he regretted the heavy loss of life from the two atomic bombs. He also said he didn't lose much sleep over it.
I do wonder how much the Americans knew what they really had before they actually dropped that first one, and then they realised how big a thing it was. But I was going to ask, you mentioned the Council of Churches petitioning for them not to use another. I was going to ask, how was the bomb reported in the US and Japan? Because it could go two ways. One being a big propaganda coup and you show the devastation, or the other being, in Japan, presumably they potentially covered it up, or do they try to spin it one way or another? It's a mystery weapon. The
contemporary response in the U.S. was overwhelmingly supportive. There were, I think, between 2/3 and 3/4 of respondents to a couple of polls, including the prestigious Gallup poll, heavily endorsing the use of atomic bombs for the very reason that Truman stated to the Council of Churches. It was to save American and Allied lives, and incidentally, to avoid the horrific loss among the Japanese, including civilians, in event of an invasion. So the fact that the U.S. waited 3 days to drop the second bomb was pretty much in keeping with the prediction made by General Leslie Groves, who oversaw the entire nuclear program, the Manhattan Project. He had predicted early in the program that if the U.S. had to drop atom bombs on Japan, of course, after Germany surrendered, and the entire Manhattan Project was predicated on a German bomb, which did not develop. Groves had always said it would take 2 bombs to convince Tokyo, the first one to get their attention, and the second to prove that the first one was no fluke. So you see a timeline for the period between the first and the second bomb, very much in keeping with what the U.S. authorities had expected.
Were the Americans able to pick up on what the internal Japanese discussions in those 3 days to understand what was going on? Did they have an awareness of the internal wranglings of surrender and not surrender, or?
Yeah, there was an enormous amount of code breaking by both the British and the Americans. I think from about 6 code breaking stations with radio intercepts. The figure I remember is that between them, the British and the Americans were decoding approximately 1 million Japanese coded messages a month. So it was intelligence on an industrial scale. The entire bitter dispute and argument for 30 years about whether the atom bombs were justified was held in an information vacuum, because those decrypts did not begin being released, open for public scrutiny, until about 1975. So you have a period from 30 years to about 40 to 45 years before the full extent of Allied intelligence about what the Japanese were thinking and planning became known. And now it's almost a dead issue as to whether the atom bombs were required, because clearly Tokyo was not about to surrender. And in fact, we knew as soon as it happened that Tokyo had asked Moscow to intervene on Japan's behalf with the Western allies. And of course, Tokyo did not realize that Operation August Storm, the massive invasion of Manchuria, was well underway in planning and preparation. So it simply was no question that Japan was not about to surrender.
What was your phrase before? Cloud
cuckoo land.
Cloud cuckoo land. What's interesting about that is, I mean, that the bombs are needed to tip them over to the brink. But Japan is being completely and utterly squeezed by the Americans at this point as well, isn't it? They're hard pressed by sea and air without even boots on the ground on the main islands. They're completely cut off and being strangled, aren't they?
That's correct. In fact, from about February of 1945, with the first carrier-launched strikes against the home islands, it was increasingly obvious that Japan was being deprived of essential imports, and not just coal or manganese or iron ore, but food. Japan had been a net importer of food since the turn of the century, so roughly 40 years. And the combination of U.S. Navy airstrikes and coastal interdiction, combined with the B-29s based in the Marianas, 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, were dropping mines in Japanese coastal waters, as well as burning down entire urban industrial areas. And that's why I refer to the cloud cuckoo land attitude, that the Japanese leaders could look out the window, if the glass was still there in the window, and see and smell what was going on. The most urgent, most immediate example was the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, when about 350 B-29s burned down 1/6 of Tokyo and killed about 85,000 people. That's in one night. And when Emperor Hirohito toured the wreckage a few days later, he saw what he saw, he smelled what he smelled, but still he declined to intervene. The fact that there had been food riots in Tokyo, and I'm not sure about elsewhere, I think from May onward, should have told any thinking Japanese that the die was cast and it was not going to end well. Japan's leaders, the Big Eight, which is the six-man war council, plus the emperor and his what's called Privy Seal, his main advisor, they did know that they could not defeat an Allied invasion and eventual occupation. But the hardliners, the three bitter enders on the War Council, felt that it was better to die fighting than to capitulate. So you have an entire nation running short of food, of steel, of coal, of manufacturing capability, with major and minor industry being bombed and incinerated. There's simply no doubt that the Allies were going to enforce the Potsdam Declaration. The question was how soon and at what cost.
I mean, you alluded to this before. There is an attempted coup, isn't there, to actually carry on fighting?
Yes, on the night of August 14th, which was the day before the Emperor's recorded broadcast, a group of diehards in the Imperial Guard, which is an elite division of the Japanese army, assassinated a couple of the Emperor's senior advisors and attempted to take over a radio station and broadcast a bitter end message to the population. They were unable to do that, although they knew that the Emperor had recorded a message to be broadcast the next day. They didn't know where the disc was. And the recording technicians and the Emperor's closest advisors had hidden that recording in a place separate from where the Emperor and his family were under close guard. So later that evening, the plotters realized that they were unsuccessful. The two leaders committed suicide on the palace grounds, and the others surrendered. The fact that the Imperial Army, or that a major command of the Imperial Army was infiltrated with those who intended to die fighting rather than to suffer the disgrace of surrender, shows how bitterly divided some elements of the Japanese government and military were.
Yeah, and they were willing to bring their country down to do it. But did the surrender come as a shock to the Japanese people? I mean, obviously the Emperor himself broadcast the announcement. I think that is the first time he'd ever been heard.
Yes, the phrase was, for the first time, the voice of the crane was heard in the land. The wording of the surrender announcement, according to a lawyer friend of mine, was a masterpiece of lawyerly obfuscation. Hirohito said that the war had, quote, not necessarily proceeded according to our desire. He also said, far be it from our intention to infringe upon the independence of other nations. And, well, really, how about asking China, Burma, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, on and on? The Emperor did not use the word surrender. He said he had agreed to accept the Allies' declaration. And he was referring to the Potsdam Declaration, which required unconditional surrender, with the exception that he, the Emperor, would be allowed to retain his position under Allied administration. And of course, that meant General MacArthur. The statement was so imprecise that some Japanese asked themselves, if the war is over, does that mean we have won? And it took a while for the reality to sink in.
Well, my next question is actually about the fighting stops. So you say films. I was thinking of the Pacific TV series that, they've surrendered and then they all sit down and have a beer. But, when the fighting stops, there is actually a space between the surrender and the formal surrender. What happens in this liminal space? Did the shooting stop, or is there sort of an uneasy truce? How did that work?
Yeah, mostly it stopped on the afternoon of August 15th. The time zones of planet Earth played a major role in how things proceeded or not. On the afternoon of the 14th, General LeMay and the Marianas had launched another major effort. I think it was about 800 B-29s attacking various targets. They were on the way back to their island bases when they monitored the announcement that Japan had accepted the surrender. So it's a really odd situation. And I quote one of the wing commanders, a brigadier general in the Army Air Forces, as saying, we took off in war and we landed in peace. And it took a while for that to sink in. On the morning and afternoon of the 15th, the Allied fleet, including the British Pacific Fleet, which operated alongside the U.S. Navy, had launched attacks against briefed targets, mainly on Honshu. The first of those aircraft were overland. Some of them were in their dives on their targets when the broadcast came through, ceasefire, ceasefire, the war is over, return to base. And most of those pilots jettisoned their bombs, but a few, including some from the carrier Ticonderoga, were already well into their attack, and they continued with dropping their bombs rather than pull out prematurely and perhaps expose themselves to anti-aircraft fire. The last combats on the day, August 15th, occurred about 2 o'clock in the afternoon due to some Japanese pilots who either chose to ignore the emperor's capitulation or did not believe it and proceeded anyway. But essentially, the shooting stopped on the afternoon of August 15th. But over the next 2 or 3 days, there were sporadic events, including the interceptions of 2 photo recon flights in the Tokyo area by U.S. bombers from Okinawa. There were casualties on both sides. So the last American fatality, combat fatality of World War II, occurred on August 18th in a B-32 Dominator, one of the lesser-known aircraft of the American war effort. 20-year-old sergeant from Pennsylvania was fatally wounded, and I think 3 or 4 Japanese were shot down. But thereafter, the Japanese complied with the order to remove the propellers from all aircraft in Japan, and additional reconnaissance flights confirmed by visual observation that that was in fact the case. In the meantime, in Manchuria, the Soviet offensive continued with daily ground combat up until almost the end of the month. When I say the day the shooting stopped, it's when it officially stopped, but actually the final surrender, of course, occurred aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September.
There's, 150,000 prisoners of war? In that 2 weeks, what happens to them? Are they still, what's their status? Are they freed? Do they remain prisoners of war?
Yeah, there were both military prisoners of war and civilian internees, both in Japan and elsewhere, in China and particularly in Indonesia. The Japanese military had issued what became known as a kill order, I think for about August 20th or so, because number one, the Japanese military itself was running short of food, and there was fear that tens of thousands of desperate Allied prisoners would revolt and make things difficult, both in the home islands and in Japanese-controlled areas elsewhere. It was premeditated murder on an industrial scale. It would have been approximately, as you say, 150,000 additional deaths. But because the Japanese largely obeyed the emperor's statement, the Japanese allowed large-scale relief flights by both the British and Americans to drop first food and then medical supplies and clothing to the compounds where prisoners and internees were being held. However, that took several days to reach all of them because it was unknown to Allied intelligence how many detention and POW camps there actually were. By and large, the internees and prisoners were provided with badly needed food and supplies within a matter of days.
So the final surrender signing, I'm intrigued about how that was organised, because and sort of the symbolism involved with it, because I was looking at the signatories and they weren't quite always who I thought they might be. How was that organised? And is it all MacArthur's staging?
To a large extent, it was. On, I think it was August 18th, MacArthur had already established radio communications with Japanese headquarters in Tokyo from his headquarters in Manila, in the Philippines. And he directed that a Japanese military and civilian delegation fly to one of the Okinawa islands, Aishima, and transfer to his personal aircraft, a Douglas C-54, and fly to Manila to confer about the details, not only for the surrender agreement, but for the actual ceremony. And that was carried out without much difficulty, as I describe in the book. Although I think there was a confusion at Aishima among the Americans with the difference between gallons and liters of fuel. And one of the Japanese planes ran short of gas and ditched in Tokyo Bay within yards of shore, but nobody was hurt, and the surrender went ahead. The nuts and bolts of the surrender ceremony aboard the battleship Missouri were well understood. In fact, a Japanese delegation, including those who were fluent in English, one of the naval officers had attended Yale University, transferred to American ships and arranged the coordination for who would attend among the Japanese delegation, where they would stand, in what order they would sign the document. So it was actually choreographed fairly well.
There's no heads of state there, is there? Oh, actually, there might be. Was Chiang Kai-shek there, or someone's signed for him? There's no.
No, he was not. China was represented by one of Chiang's chief deputies, but no other head of state attended, because MacArthur represented the supreme headquarters of all the Allies. Admiral Nimitz signed for the United States, and then various senior military officers signed for the other Allies, of course, including Britain, Australia, New Zealand, France, the Netherlands. They were all represented.
We sort of got to the end. We've got through the signing. My only other question, because I was fascinated by this, was this idea, which doesn't really fit in with where I've been going. So I thought I would save it to the end as an adjunct. This transfer of technology between the Germans and the Japanese, I was completely fascinated by the Japanese prototype jet fighter, which ran on pine nut oil. Do you want to tell me about that? Because it just sounds fantastic, or fantastical.
The Japanese military attaché, or maybe the air attaché to Berlin, had witnessed some early flights of the prototype Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet fighter. I think that was as early as 1942. So obviously, the Japanese were interested in acquiring that technology, but it took quite a while for the two German programs, the Messerschmitt 262 jet and the Messerschmitt 163 rocket-powered fighter, to be transferred to Japan. The Messerschmitt was too large to disassemble and put in a submarine. So a couple of Japanese submarines made the enormously long globe-trotting journeys from Singapore to Germany, and loaded aboard a disassembled Me-163 with drawings and and a rocket engine, and parts and engines and detailed drawings of the Me-262 jet. The submarine, with most of the information, transferred the drawings and some parts ashore at Hong Kong, I think. I would have to double check, and then left for Japan, but it was sunk by American ships before reaching Japan. So Japan still had the drawings and some of the parts, and was able to reverse engineer some of the items, and did in fact build a duplicate Me-163, which did not fly. And then the Japanese Army Air Force contracted with Nakajima, I think, to build a Japanese version of the ME-262. And if you look at what they called the Kika, it bears a family resemblance to the Messerschmitt, but its development was badly delayed, and the test flight only occurred on August 9th, which of course was the day of the Nagasaki atomic bomb, and it crashed on takeoff. So nothing came of that program.
Running on pine nut oil actually got to take off, as it were, even if it crashed. I wonder why the Germans had never saw the opportunity of using pine nut oil rather than petrol, as they were short of it.
Well, the Germans did not have a shortage. In fact, they had begun manufacturing synthetic fuel from synthetic oil before the war, I think from about 1938. So that was not a major concern.
Well, that is perhaps a topic for another day. Thank you, Barrett. Loyal listener, I will put a link on the website and in the show notes. Barrett's book is When the Shooting Stopped, August 1945. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, why not head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast to become a patron of the show. By committing to $1 or so each month, it helps me to put aside the time to produce the podcast. And it's a big thank you to those who are already patrons. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our tank, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.